Welcome to History 111, Lecture 42, Winning the War. The Civil War began on an idea that was very simple and also very wrong. And that idea was all that was necessary was to march into your opponent's capital, take possession of it, negotiate a peace treaty, call it a day, and the war will be over in a couple of weeks. Now, that was basically the idea that framed the Battle of First Bull Run. Now, the two capitals are only 90 miles apart, so people thought there would be one good battle and the war would be over. So 30,000 Union troops are going to march from Washington, D.C. and try to take Richmond, and they're going to clash at a river called Bull Run. And people are going to come out in large numbers to have a picnic and watch the battle, and when the Union loses this battle and their lines break, the Union troops ultimately have to stampede over to civilians, and they're going to cause a lot of chaos. Now, even though the South wins, they don't have the strength in the battle to pursue the Union troops. So in other words, this idea that they would have one big battle and be over, well, as it turns out, they would have one battle and neither side would be in position to continue immediately. Now, for a lot of the war, the Eastern theater is a stalemate. The two sides don't have enough strength to really get at each other's capitals. And early in the war, there are successful small-scale campaigns being launched elsewhere. The rival governments in Missouri clashed and ended quickly with the Union in control. McClellan moves in from Ohio and seizes the coal-rich portions of western Virginia, and that's an area in which the population supports the Union, so they're able to gain control there. In 1862, there's going to be a significant attempt to break that stalemate, and McClellan's going to land forces behind the Confederate lines and fight a bitter battle at Seven Pines, followed by a clash with Lee in what's known as the Battle of the 7 Days. Now, McClellan's ultimately going to secure his position with naval support, and he has a clear path to Richmond and secure supply lines, but he doesn't renew the campaign because he believes that his soldiers need rest and aren't ready and need a little bit of time to get organized. Now, Lincoln keeps sending him these messages that he needs to get going, he needs to do something before Lee can regroup. And when McClellan doesn't do it, Lincoln orders Pope to take a small force into northern Virginia, and Pope engages Lee before McClellan ever moves to support him, and Pope's forces are put into disarray, and Pope is ultimately fired. And what's happened as a result is McClellan's army is behind Lee, and there's no Union army of any significance in front of him, so Lee goes on the rampage across Maryland, and McClellan now has to move to intercept him, because he can't go after Richmond because of all the threats that Lee is causing. Now, McClellan does know that Lee has split his army and a significant force under Jackson has moved to raid Harper's Ferry, but McClellan doesn't take advantage, and they finally engage at Antietam and a bitter battle ensues. Lee's army is nearly broken, but Jackson arrives just in time to save the Confederate army, and Lee is allowed to withdraw in good order. Now, that's technically a Union victory, but it's a major strategic loss, and Lincoln fires McClellan. Lincoln believes that if McClellan had acted earlier, he could have done something while the path to Richmond was secure and available to him, but instead he sat and he sat and he sat and refused orders to move on, and that allowed Lee to go ahead and go on the rampage across Maryland. At this stage, the Eastern Theater is going to go through a couple of commanders, and Hooker is going to be appointed, and he's going to lose his nerve at Chancellorsville. And at that battle, Lee is outnumbered 2-1, but Lee fights brilliantly and gets to the point where Hooker barely escapes. And after this, the Union Army is truly afraid of Lee. They believe that Lee is this unbeatable war machine, and that means that Union commanders are going to be very timid when facing him for a while. Now, on the Eastern Front, it's important to remember that Lee doesn't need to win, he just needs to make sure the Union never does either, because it's a defensive war. He doesn't have to defeat the Union, he has to prevent the Union from defeating him, and he's doing that very successfully. So in a lot of ways, on the East, the war is going on the South side. But now out in the West, events are going to take shape that are going to start to shift the war in the Union's way. And in 1862, there's going to be a squadron of ironclads that are going to besiege New Orleans and force it to surrender, and that's going to cut off the center of southern banking and the second largest trading port in the South. And it's also going to mean the Union controls the mouth of the Mississippi River, so any Confederate shipping that relies on using the Mississippi River to get to sea is now going to be cut off and can no longer be used. At that same time, Grant is going to move down the Tennessee River with naval support and seize control of vital railway lines. And the effect of this campaign is that by the end of 1862, the Union has deprived the South of a lot of its major transport infrastructure in the West. And that's going to mean what's happening is the West is going to be taken out of this war one little piece at a time. And this is a war in which ultimately the South is going to have difficulty sustaining a long conflict, and what they're doing by cutting off the West is depriving the South of vital reinforcements and supplies. Now, by 1863, Grant has nearly completed his campaign to capture the Mississippi River, and they're down to two Confederate strongholds. Vicksburg is one that Grant's going to move on, and other Union forces are going to move up from New Orleans to capture the other. Now, Lee recognizes the threat that Grant's campaign poses, and he's going to go ahead and invade Pennsylvania in an attempt to relieve pressure on Vicksburg. And in so doing, what he's trying to do is move into Pennsylvania and threaten to surround Washington, D.C. through a big hook. Now, if he does this, that's going to cause major problems for the Union war effort, so he's really trying to get them to focus on the East where the South has advantages and is strong. Now, the two armies, the Union and Lee, are going to meet at Gettysburg, and Lee is going to be outnumbered. But Lee's battle plan is going to fail. Usually being outnumbered is not a problem for Lee, but in this particular case it doesn't work for him. And he's going to lose a third of his army in the first 2 days of the battle. And he's going to be forced to withdraw back to Virginia, and he's never going to have the strength to threaten the North again. Now, Vicksburg surrenders the same day as the Battle of Gettysburg concludes, and Grant is free to advance into the rest of Tennessee and pose a threat from the west. Now, Grant is going to go ahead and move from Vicksburg to gain control of the rest of the Tennessee Valley and access to northern Georgia, and he's going to have this complete by the end of 1863, at which point Lincoln's going to go ahead and put him in overall command of the Union armies, and Grant is going to order a two-pronged assault. Grant and his subordinate Meade are going to go ahead and attempt to force Lee into a decisive battle in the east, whereas Grant's most trusted general, Sherman, is going to move on Atlanta and try to destroy the remaining Confederate forces there. And what ultimately the goal is to keep Joe Johnston's army from coming up and joining up with Lee's and forming a more stronger and more defensible situation in Virginia. Now, Grant ends up chasing Lee and is only able to engage in indecisive battles. Cold Harbor is a particularly important one. There's heavy losses on both sides, but Lee is not broken. Grant is going to have to change strategy, so he's going to move to cut Richmond off from the Confederates rather than attack it directly. And he's going to try to take railway centers of places like Petersburg, and Lee is going to be forced to move to rescue Petersburg, where Grant is able to besiege it for 9 months and hold Lee up there. Now, Sherman, on the other hand, back in Georgia, is going to take Atlanta and break the Confederate army, and Sherman does something extremely bold. He's going to race across Georgia, essentially unopposed, and he's going to do so with no supply lines, no ability to resupply himself, and depending on speed. Now, Sherman believes that he can find enough food and so on just by traveling through this area and raiding that he can sustain his army. Well, he is going to go ahead and destroy everything in military value in what becomes known as the March to the Sea. Now, this was something that people believe was crazy and that nobody can do this because he had no supplies, he had no extra ammo, no extra food, nothing to rely on. If he got stuck or bogged down, his soldiers would starve. But he's able to go really, really fast and get all the way up to the ocean and be relieved by the Union Navy there. And then once he's on the East Coast, he can actually go ahead and march up through the Carolinas. And he says to his soldiers when he gets to South Carolina that they started the war and they ought to be punished. So the campaign through South Carolina is particularly brutal. But once he enters North Carolina, what Lee is looking at is he is now cut off from all reinforcements and all supplies, and he has Grant to the north of him and Sherman marching up from the south. Now, Lee at this point realized the battle is hopeless. He's down to about 25,000 troops. Grant has cut off all of his escape routes. So Lee's forces are starving out of supplies, so Lee does the only thing he can and he surrenders. Now, Jefferson Davis is going to order the Confederate troops into the hills to take up guerrilla warfare, but the South was beaten and the generals knew it, so they all pretty much surrendered shortly after Lee. So what's the big idea? Well, the whole strategy is called the Anaconda Plan, choke the South to death. Now, really what they're doing is Grant is cutting one piece of the South off at a time, and every time he does that, he denies supplies and reinforcements, and that is slowly going to strangle the South. And ultimately, the South surrenders not because their armies were destroyed or because they were beaten in battle, but because they no longer have the ability to fight, and they can no longer sustain this campaign. See you in the next lecture.